great excitement for me, and I think for all of you. I think Mimi said we hope you will enjoy it and benefit from this, but I know you will. And a little sadness, this digital transformation series has just been fabulous. I encourage you all, if you happen to be catching this talk as the first or the first one you've seen in the series, please visit the SERC Talks website. The previous speakers that covered perspectives on complexity from the C-suite as it relates to systems development, and wonderful talk on urban transportation and transformation. And then today's talk by David Zion they've all been wonderful in their own ways. And really the perspective, or the different dimensions and application domains outside of the defense and security has also been, I think, really insightful for this series. So really excited to see David's talk today. So without further ado, I'm going to briefly highlight a few things from David's bio, which again is at the SERC Talk website, and as well as his presentation that you can take a look at afterwards. Actually, I'll jump to something earlier. David does have some experience in the defense electronics area, so he knows a little bit about some of the challenges perhaps some of you here on the webinar have experienced and are currently working on. But he's currently the strategic program leader at Phillips Healthcare, and is really leading some major efforts, and actually spent 20 years in a prior emphasis role leading the ultrasound systems research and development team, which is such an important application, of course, and as well as having its own complexities, I'm sure. And his leadership of that team has produced tremendous progress in that application area. And in 2018, importantly for our context here, he founded and now leads the Systems Engineering Center of Excellence at Phillips, where he has a team dedicated, as the name suggests, to deploying the best practices in all our aspects of architecture, modeling, design, integration, and lifecycle management. So if we could convince David to spend the time, he could survey almost all of the SERC research and provide us some excellent feedback there as well. So really just excited to have someone so deeply experienced and accomplished as David to be speaking with us today on the topic of digitalization and AI and how that improves healthcare delivery. So David, again, thank you. Get ready for some great feedback and questions that I'm sure are coming from our audience as you conclude your presentation. But for now, please share with us what you'd like to say.
Great. Well, thank you for that really kind introduction. It really is a privilege to be here. Healthcare has many opportunities to apply systems thinking. And you mentioned, that it'd be great for us to share in systems engineering. I'm sure we also, as a provider to our customers, have plenty to gain by learning from what's going on in Systems Engineering Research Center. And I really am pleased to be able to present in this forum, and want to thank everybody for this opportunity. I'd also like to thank our Phillips CTO, Hank Van Houten, for his work on an earlier version of this presentation, which was given at the Embedded Systems Innovation Group in the Netherlands a little ways back. So let me advance here. And this is really, as was introduced, how are digitalization and AI driving improvements in healthcare delivery. And let me just say that working in healthcare is truly a privilege. Helping improve people's lives is really what brings excitement and engagement to the work that we do at Phillips, and it's what we do every day. And addressing what is an ever-changing set of clinician and patient needs is indeed the challenge that we face as a provider of products and solutions. Phillips, just a little background, is a health technology company. We're dedicated to improving people's health and their well-being through meaningful innovation. And really our goal is to improve 2.5 billion lives per year, and to do that by 2030. And in that also is making sure we're focused on 400 million of those are in underserved communities. So it's a pretty tall order. And some of what we're going to talk about today is how are we changing as a company to both achieve that goal, but also to take advantage of what's going on, in these spaces. So let's start with what we're seeing in trends that are really making a difference for health technology. So I think we all recognize global resource constraints, that healthcare, there's a growing need for healthcare delivery to be efficient and cost effective. That's true just all around the globe. It's certainly true in less resourced places as well. We also see that there's aging populations and the rise of chronic illnesses like heart disease, respiratory conditions, and this is creating a need for us to shift care to networked, lower cost settings and even the home. We have increasing consumer and patient engagement. That's really a good thing, right? This is where all of us are taking greater interest in healthy lifestyles, but also in our health decisions, especially as we go through, any interactions in care delivery. And then the last trend, which I'll start on, is really digitalization, and this is really having quite a profound impact, obviously, in healthcare delivery. It already impacts so many areas of our lives today, but it's reached a point in healthcare where what we see is that the value in healthcare is shifting away from just standalone products to those solutions that really comprise systems, devices, software, and services. So it's a real broadening area right now. And the first topic I want to take on is basically, how is digitalization changing how we work as a company? So in many ways, digitalization, as you see by the line, is the force behind the transformation at Phillips. So a little bit of history. So Phillips just celebrated its 130th year. That makes it officially an old company. And it's basically developed into a worldwide conglomerate by building on technology bases. And from those, spawning to products that address new markets and new customers. It's essentially lots of diversification. And it starts with vacuum technology, and you can see the list of products there that really emanated from that. And then later on in semiconductors, and an even wider array of products that affected so many aspects of people's lives. But as we've moved towards digitalization, that for Phillips has really led to what we'll call deverticalization. And basically, we have moved from technology-based expansion to a focused health technology company, essentially finding a new approach for customer value as opposed to diversification. That's a big change in direction. And by the way, Phillips is not likely alone in that change. I think many organizations are looking to focus, beyond the actual, devices or products that they're putting out and finding greater value in that wider ecosystem. So, the true value of digitalization is not just in the acquisition of data through, unique technology, but it's also the process and sharing of that data to improve an entire enterprise's operation. And in the case of healthcare, it's to improve the care delivered to patients by our customers. So look at Phillips today. Our entire focus is in health technology. We're placing strong investment in developing not just groundbreaking data acquisition devices, but the systems, services, and solutions to transform the way the customers we serve operate. So let's talk about the digital revolution itself and what that looks like. If we look at this example of a camera, it starts with taking a mechanical device, digitization, different than digitalization, right? And bringing that into a higher level of integration of functionality, eventually hooking it up to a wider range of opportunities through the internet, and then into an ecosystem of digital propositions. And what's very interesting here is that the space that those digital propositions operate under, the size of the population they're serving, is much, much larger than those who developed the camera in the first place. And so you have a camera that leads to many other elements and a much wider footprint. So we could look at that more generally and call this the pathway of the digital revolution, and it's modeled in this cube. And the idea is that we move from analog to digital really as a single function device. Over time, we combine more and more things into that device, making it multi-purpose, followed by hooking that up to a system, perhaps a network of devices, and then finding that once you have that, it creates an opportunity in what we'll call a system of systems to drive much broader functionality than anybody intended, either with a single function device or even the combination of those functions. There are lots of examples here. So if we look at cell phones, pretty recent. In the 80s, we had analog cell phones, mostly in cars. Those were sized down for the sake of power consumption, mobility, cost. And we had basically digital cell phones, certainly by in the late 80s and early 90s. Then we brought more function into them. So people started taking pictures and texting, and then soon email arrived. And we were starting to hook that up to a wider data environment in a system, basically to the internet. Well, along came smartphones, and all of a sudden the cell phone was just an access device to a system, and then soon a system of systems, such that cell phones today essentially play a part in many of the things we do all day long, right? And nobody would really think of accessing many of the things they do today without having that cell phone. So let's see if there's an example, in our healthcare space. So the example here is in hospital patient monitoring devices. So as you can see, many years ago, we had a first patient monitor. It was basically based on oscilloscope technology, but soon thereafter, those basically came into other applications for vital signs. They were each packaged in their own in their own instrumentation, and so that's where we have this single function embodiment of what are very important to track in a hospital ward. Over time, we started combining those and miniaturizing such that, in today's patient monitoring world, you have the combination of all these functions, and everything basically is plug and play together. And this enables, really a streamlined way of monitoring patients when they're in various places in the hospital. Along with that came central stations, integrations into the general ward, ICU, and so on. So here we're back into the multifunction space, and now we're even hooked into the hospital, the broader hospital environment. But now how do we get to the system of systems benefit? And this really comes through the advent of clinical decision support that can be done based on the data that is coming from that patient monitoring installation. And it's not, of course, just the clinical data, but also how the machines themselves are running so that one can address some of those challenges that we see in healthcare in terms of lower costs and access to care. What we also see here is that the monitoring is not just something we think about in the ICU, but rather has a broad spectrum of application, be it from preoperative planning all the way through to recovery at home. And it is that element that it is no longer about a single product, but rather that system of systems that will help to give a continuous experience to the patient that is really transformative and the result of digitalization. And so again, in summary here, the trend is to go from single product instantiation to multiple products to systems of systems. And it really does change. It has changed certainly us in Phillips and how we address that. It also changes how we deploy to the customers. And in our case, customers are basically the hospitals, governments, insurers, and consumers, and how they experience healthcare is changed as a result of this. So how do we put that all together? Well, first is that all of these other digital technologies now can play a role in how it is we deliver what we'll call a solution. And it is no longer, again, any one of these could be very highly valuable within the acquisition device, say a patient monitor or an MR machine, but brought all together, you provide the ability to provide a completely, a much more enhanced patient experience and care cycle. So let's talk about solutions and outcomes, because we have digitalization, which drove us away from singular products. But what does that look like in terms of how it shows up in the healthcare system? So here we see 3 examples. And these are, again, cases where we're leveraging what we already see as strong medical devices, which are already serving very important purpose in terms of patient care. But the idea is to really provide end-to-end solutions, and it leverages the strength of the devices, which gather the data, but also drives the care cycle for patients and clinicians. Those clinicians are looking to drive value for their organizations and enhance the patient experience. And having connected devices, systems, and solutions are basically what makes that happen. So if we take a look at image-guided therapy, we start with an interventional procedure, which already dramatically reduces a hospital stay and patient recovery time. So right there, we're looking at better economics for the hospital, and certainly better health outcome for the patient if they're recovering, outside of traditional hospital setting. But now we complement that with ways to streamline the workflow during that intervention, improve the follow-up treatment protocols, and help hospitals manage the systems and solutions so that they have the right levels of capacity and usage for their systems. That smooths the flow of patients through their facilities, and again makes for a better patient experience. Hospitals themselves are going through their own transformation. All of us in North America, we are already in the U.S. We see that consolidation of hospital facilities. It's pretty rare to find a community hospital or even a larger institution that is not part of a greater network of care facilities. And as you can see, there are similar trends elsewhere in the world as well. The other thing that we see is really a change in terms of how decisions are made about healthcare devices and medical devices. Typically, at one time, the key people who were making decisions were the clinician and the person using the devices day in, day out. And they still have a role, but much of the decision making now is at the C-suite level, where the leaders and stakeholders in a hospital are looking at much greater levels of what we'll call key performance indicators, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But you can see there's an array of people who have different responsibilities than those people literally on the ground doing the imaging or working with patients. And we need to be able to take both into account, because again, it is not just about the device, but about the full solution and its impact on the operations of a medical facility. So we saw in the digitalization discussion that diversification has essentially given way to that focused end-to-end approach. So we're moving from expanded offerings in a diverse way into integrated offerings. And the data that they generate is really what ends up yielding the customer value. And the tagline, or I'll call it the big shift, is what we is what we see at the bottom here. Is that it's a solution only if it addresses the customer's KPIs, and that really is part and parcel of becoming what we call an outcomes company. So, what outcomes are we looking for? So we call this the quadruple aim, and if we look to those stakeholders, but also the greater interests of the public at large, what are we searching for here? Better health outcomes, obviously, improved patient experience, which is not just about how well did the situation turn out, but rather what was the experience of the patient moving through the care cycle? Were there appointments for them? Was their care coordinated? Were they able to move from facility to facility in a seamless manner? Then we have improved staff experience, and we all know that retaining the best talent is important for all organizations, and making sure that those in the hospital have the most both engaging but also efficient experience is critical. And then finally, last but not least, is overall lowering the cost of operations and the cost of care and the burden that cost has really on hospitals, but all the rest of us as well. And so again, we could think about individual devices and the great things that they can do for healthcare delivery, but we also need to think about the wider system deployments that really make the quadruple aim, if you will, possible. So if we go back to the patient monitoring example that I mentioned during the digitalization discussion, we can see how that applies to the quadruple aim. We talked about some of the forward-looking things like clinical decision support. Well, there's also lots of information there already about how patients are doing. Is a patient deteriorating, and can we take action proactively to be able to avoid a worse situation? And what's interesting about it, so this is really, again, a system laid on top of existing systems in patient monitoring to really make a difference for those items that are important to our customers, the hospitals. And it's measured in terms of that quadruple aim that you see there. And so it is a bit of a change in mindset as to the way, for example, not just the way we deploy products, but the way we even design our systems to make all of this possible. Oops, there we go. Trouble with my slide. Okay, so then we see a completely different situation here. So what we see is an ultrasound exam, and I happen to be close to this, but that exam is happening in a satellite clinic. But it is happening with real-time collaboration through secure connections and a centrally located physician that can view images real-time and give guidance on, perhaps that ultrasound clinician is seeing something out of the ordinary. So this is, again, layering a system on top of another, not a rather sophisticated system itself as the data acquisition device. And it definitely drives more efficient workflow. So had this collaboration not in this case, if that collaboration could not take place, what would happen is that the person undergoing this examination would be told, well, I see something here that I don't necessarily know what this is about. And instead of getting an immediate resolution, we'll schedule a follow-up exam for you in our larger institution. So now let's think about that. That is an extra trip for the patient. They have to go to a central location. It is yet another scanning session on an ultrasound machine and finding the time and capacity for that. And worse yet, let's think about the patient's mindset in that something has come up. and now they have to wait, maybe a week or something like that before we gain resolution. So again, it's about efficiency, but it's also about the patient experience and potentially better health outcomes as well. Okay, so I lost my. All right, so we could also look at the way solutions go across other areas. And in this particular example, this is in oncology. And what we see is we see solutions that really cover the entire oncology care cycle. And it starts with being able to take the data from multiple acquisition devices and fuse that together. Once again, when these come from all different places within an institution and in different forms, how to bring that together into a unified and intelligent way so that clinicians can do a really good job in terms of therapy selection. And then from that, come up with the personalized for that patient therapy execution, again, which could be done in the coordination of multiple paths through a healthcare facility. When these are done well, this results in great efficiency for the institution, but it also certainly improves the patient journey in what is likely a very difficult situation. And that coordination of both diagnosis as well as therapy can make a big difference in the experience that patient has. Now, solutions themselves can be at an office level, it could be at the department level or an enterprise space. But the thing that is common here is that both require a shift from thinking about it in terms of products to full solutions, and from transaction to relationship. And that goes for the relationship between a medical device provider and the institution, but also from the patient and their clinicians. And if we think about how the patient experiences a transactional route through the healthcare delivery system, that is not going to produce as nearly as good an experience as one where it is well coordinated. So we have digitalization, which has really made a difference in terms of how we think about products and solutions. We then have solutions which are deployed to really connect the elements of a care cycle in a coordinated way that really aim not just to produce great results at each step, but also to satisfy the needs of what we call the quadruple aim, right? And chief amongst that are lower cost, greater patient satisfaction, greater staff satisfaction, patient experience, and of course, better health outcomes. But along the way, when we started working on solutions, we all of a sudden are collecting a lot of data. And when we start to look at the use of that data, we see lots of opportunity to further enhance what we can do in healthcare delivery. So let's look at the customers that are basically consuming that data. So, the best place, of course, to start is, the patient. And, if the patient has access to information, that'll help them work with their caregivers to drive choices. There are many cases today where patients, they certainly have access to data in most instances, but it can be quite disjointed. And how to get the results from one institution versus what they see elsewhere can be very challenging. For healthcare providers, they usually have very good access to data, but that data usually has to be within their own institution. And if they're trying to get that access from other places, that can be at times challenging depending on the network, the hospital network that they're running in. So that's the individual health data. But what about the population data itself? And this is where there are other consumers that would have great use for data. So we think about the hospital administrators, if they have access to how people are moving through their system, how is care being delivered, what tests are being run, what is the flow for a patient journey, they can make really strong decisions on capacity planning, on how they acquire equipment, and how they change their resource profile in their network. We also see in the IT space, they are looking at performance and security of their networks and understanding how patients are moving through the hospital makes a big difference to, again, how they deploy resources. And then finally, we have researchers and developers. So from the research perspective, there's a large opportunity in the data that is being acquired to look at population health to understand what treatments are working, what tests are producing results, follow-up appointments, how well are we seeing compliance in terms of follow-up treatment. And so there's lots of information here available to researchers to make progress. And on the development side, having data, real data that's from these institutions can make a difference in the applications that are developed to solve problems that we might not even know about now in terms of how we are delivering care. And so these are all really the opportunity space we have in the data that we're generating from these solutions. We call this, in Phillips, we call this a system of engagement. So in most facilities, we have electronic medical records, and this is really the system of record. It keeps the patient history, we have medication, we understand most everything that has gone on with that patient, and generally speaking, have good access to the information we would need to further their care. But when we think about a system of engagement, that is really how it is we connect that system of record to those areas where we can make a difference in that quadruple aim. Right. So imagine that you're coming in for a CT exam, and wouldn't it be nice if the person running the CT machine had access to the data from your prior ultrasound that may have happened 3 weeks ago, and it automatically populates on the machine so that the person understands how to position somebody, or might be aware of some indications here to the way they position the patient on the table, on the bench. And that's just one example. Wouldn't it be great if those in the hospital had understanding of who was treated when, how long it took, and the capacity for the different products and devices that are in their hospital? And then furthermore, beyond the EMR, we also have other hospital data. For example, how we're managing our machines. And if we have, just like we have understanding of a deteriorating patient in a serious patient monitoring world, we also could have access to understand how machines are running, so that if there's preventative maintenance ahead, we can essentially decrease the downtime that we'll experience, knowing that that's the case. And you can see how all of these things in the system in between that system of engagement makes many of the quadruple aim elements possible. So here's an interesting example of using that system of engagement, right? And this is when we know the data, we can understand our capacities in different areas of the hospital. And there is no time that this was more important than last year, certainly. The benefits of this had to be very, very clear, because this is how hospitals can optimize how equipment is utilized. And certainly during the height of the pandemic, we saw this in action by necessity. People were securing the necessary resources to treat COVID patients, but also providing remote services for those who would best stay clear of hospital environments. And I'm sure very challenging decisions had to be made in the ICU about who is in and who needs to be in. and how do we do other types of monitoring in other places to help clear that capacity. Very, very challenging choices for healthcare providers, and of course we all owe a debt of gratitude for those who persevered through some very difficult times. Now, through this, we also saw that a shift in the way medical providers would lend services to their patients through telemedicine and new means of reimbursement to make that happen. And this has really changed healthcare delivery once again. And much of this technology, and we're using it right now in some form, was available, but it certainly has taken a much larger role in hospital environments. That system of engagement provides the data to basically help make that run quite a bit more smoothly. If we take this to a limit, and this is, ultimately for a medical care facility to have more complete knowledge and insight as to how they're delivering care, what are patient outcomes, and what are they doing for their resource utilization, it's those systems of engagement that are going to make that possible. And here you see, sort of an embodiment of those ideas into an operations center, which is basically reacting to different levels of utilization of equipment and patients through the system. So we basically saw digitalization. It drove us to solutions. Those solutions gave us the gift of lots of data that we could use to further drive the aims of, the quadruple aim. But what we also have is an opportunity with that data and other means to change how efficient we are in each stage of those solutions. And that's where there's an expanding role of AI. So first of all, from a business perspective, there's no shortage of opportunity. There's an enormous set of needs to drive efficiency, and to do that, use of AI is already, well underway in many of these areas. But you can see, most prominently in healthcare, there's clinical decision support and reducing errors in medication. And there's lots of people very interested in this, and our progress here will make a difference in because you can see these market numbers show that there's a lot of efficiency to be wrung out of the system through these means. Now, AI, the way we think about it today, is mostly in the cloud. It lives in what I'll call a post-data acquisition world. And it's very useful for, certainly population health and understanding, how to identify disease states in images or in other parameters that we get from acquisition devices. But more and more, the ability to do AI is going into the devices themselves. And so what we see is essentially, AI in real time. And, I'll go again back to an ultrasound example where there are thousands of parameters which are basically adjustable, if you will, to produce the best image possible. And clinicians are looking for very subtle changes in images to really make a diagnosis. That makes taking just the right image very difficult. Now, if the machine knows what it's looking at, it can in real time make many adjustments to highlight the actual the clinical state that we want to get in that picture. And so that is really taking a lot out of the hands of operators who often need to be trained for months and months to be able to catch these very difficult images to capture. Now, we need to think about AI in an ethical sense. There's very important what's on this slide, and we think about validation of the data that we're using to drive our algorithms, and our it's clear that needs to be from the right representative test data. And even recently, when we think about clinical trials or clinical study for vaccines, we've actually seen reports where it may not represent the full population for which it's intended. And so that's something we need to think about in AI. Patient data is personal data. And so patients need to be, very much cognizant of how it is any data that is taken will be used. And so they need to basically be part of that consent picture. And then, of course, it goes without saying that everything we do with this data that we've been gifted with is only used to improve healthcare and not used for other restrictions. And then lastly, the institutions that we sell these systems to, they themselves need the ability to show that they are compliant, that they are doing all the right things. And so having them have a really strong level of transparency in these systems really helps them prove to those who are auditing them that everything is meeting the highest ethical responsibility. When we think about effective use of AI, there's nothing here which I think will be surprising to this audience. Much of this is useful in other spaces outside of healthcare. But when we think about its use in terms of efficiency, as I noted earlier, there's lots of opportunity here in terms of how we configure systems, how we do reporting, how we understand how systems integrate into a care path. And AI, looking at the history of all of those things and using that experience to drive new workflow, better efficiency, drives real opportunity in healthcare delivery. So if we look at radiology, which is, of course, a huge field in imaging of all types and a big part of the overall diagnosis that many patients, experience. And what we see is there still is fair bit of inconsistency in certain modalities depending on the operator and their skill level. And, it's difficult. Remember, we talked about staff satisfaction. There are patients with very difficult conditions, which makes them difficult themselves to image. Well, how can we use AI to make the acquisition of those images more consistent and simply easier for those operating those devices? There's a figure that basically says that 5% of all of the MRI exams that we take have motion artifacts. And this is something that, again, using AI, we should be able to, wring many of those out. When we do reporting in radiology, which is a huge field, I mean, in terms of how the information is delivered, and some of you may have seen your own reports or those of relatives, where the reporting information is very terse. You went through a whole exam and you just got 3 words that said nothing found or something like that. And yet there's lots of ability for more information to be put into that report using the data that we've captured from prior exams, either as a serial study for one person or actually looking at it in a population health sense. One last thing, actually I'll talk about that here, which is, it's not just about the actual health data, but it's about more mundane things like how are systems scheduled, and can we be using AI to do better scheduling of what are challenging use of assets. And that's just one example. The last slide showed how AI was really all about the diagnosis and making that better, but you can see through this picture that AI really can be applied throughout the care cycle, be it in terms of how data is interpreted, reporting, and then how the decisions are made, amongst a panel of clinicians when they go to review cases. All right, and so we talked about the patient data, but there's also the machine data, and this is an example where we have products that basically are looking to achieve the goals of that quadruple aim, but doing so by understanding how the machines are working. And you can see, again, measuring efficiency, measuring key parameters are what's going to make a difference in cost, in staff satisfaction, and in patient experience. Now, nobody does this alone. So, in Phillips, our goal is really to provide, really strong acquisition devices, that system of engagement, but the work, the applications that come from those deployments really have to be a shared responsibility, not just for medical device providers, but for those in academia, those in the clinical setting, and as well as a whole ecosystem of startups that are interested in addressing some of those larger AI market opportunities that we took a look at earlier. And so creating standard interfaces, curation tools, making those available to actually be able to make sense of the data that we're getting are just examples of how we can deliver greater productivity to the development of new AI solutions and better care delivery. So this all basically comes together across an entire ecosystem. It could be about how we connect the various steps of care using AI to figure out how patients go through a particular care journey. It could be about monitoring the capacity and equipment that goes on within an institution. It could be about how we're monitoring patients at home post release from a hospital facility. And it really can be about driving a more precise diagnosis by eliminating uncertainty in images or other parameters that are being taken. If we look at this in the furthest long run, we could think about the digital twin, and I'm sure many in this audience are working on digital twin types of systems engineering opportunities in the context of jet engines and factory floors. But ultimately, these same concepts can apply when we think about data for patients, looking at population health, and how do we model disease states in a way that we can make the best choices for patients going through a hospital setting. So, in summary, we've explored really 5 ways in which healthcare innovation is changing. First is we discussed the fact that we're moving from individual products to solutions, and that solutions mindset is what's driving greater value for healthcare providers. Furthermore, that value is aligned with the very things that they are measuring and that they are being held accountable for in that environment. Hospitals are already transforming themselves, creating the platforms that are necessary to make all this happen. And what is really required is that system engagement on top of those platforms to connect what those systems of record can bring us with all the devices and patient activities that go on within that facility. And then lastly, as I noted, none of this happens without a lot of collaboration amongst parties from all parts of the ecosystem. So with that, I really want to thank everybody for listening. I welcome questions and look forward to them. And thank you.
Excellent, David. Top to bottom, excellent presentation, very intriguing. I would say hopeful too, frankly. Your whole storyline and the quadruple benefits clearly are good, as we try to achieve these. We meaning not just your company, of course, but all the relevant companies and stakeholders. I mean, life on this earth gets much better if those things are achieved. So I would like to encourage our audience to chime in with their questions. I have one, and actually Mimi has posted a couple more. So, and I forgot, Mimi, can we go a little bit past the hour if there's a few more questions? I forgot.
A little bit would be okay.
A little bit for David? Okay. So I'll try to be quick. Of course, whenever I hear system of systems, I get excited, and your
So do I.
use of the term in this context is spot on. Of course, one of the challenges in many types of systems is the individual objectives and managerial and operational independence of the components. So towards the end, you had a slide that you kind of talked about that broader ecosystem to include many small companies. I mean, is that still kind of a challenge to make this fabric work if these different players and technology providers may have slightly different objectives? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it really comes down to having, those standard interfaces, which of course near and dear to us as systems engineers. But of course, the details matter. And, most of this is really about, data protocols and making sure that everybody understands, well-published interfaces and what that means. I find also that, it's often the corner cases that are most difficult to address. And it might be in terms of performance, it might be in terms of security, and these things also need to be in play when we think about the open innovation that we're talking about, because a miss there could create obviously a very big problem for a hospital environment, and so keeping that close to the heart is also very critical.
Indeed. Mimi, why don't you go ahead and voice your questions?
Yeah, I had a couple that came up from it, but kind of keeping in line with what you're mentioning, do you find that some of that digitalization has drawbacks in terms of patient care, like affecting, like does that affect strategy and deployment? For instance, and it's a very minuscule example and very at the ground level, I should say, but having patients trying to ask their healthcare provider a question and getting kind of stuck in the automated scheduling system line, or having those that automation thought out well enough to have those who may not pay attention to all the details in terms of how to utilize these automated systems, if you will, thinking about sort of those ways for folks who are not as in tune to utilize?
I think that's a great question. In fact, we even saw examples of that during the initial rush for COVID vaccines, where there was certainly a population of people who weren't able to manage through the the signups. The whole idea of those solutions and that system of engagement is in fact to enable caregivers to be able to respond more quickly and more efficiently to that, to free up their time so they actually have time to take on literally the special cases where people can't do it themselves, or hey, you know what, there is no capacity and now what, right? And it's again, those are the cases that become most interesting. The whole idea is to, as I reflect, and this happens within companies as well, change is also a challenge for everybody. And so even within hospitals, but even within companies, people get used to doing things the way that they've done them for a long time. And sometimes the new systems that come about to actually make things better can be seen as threatening, because that's a whole new way of working, and that needs to be adopted. So, training people is as much a part of the solution as are the devices, systems, and data that we're all processing. And without that consultation and appropriate rollout, then you're right, you can end up with chaos and actually a dissatisfaction factor if not done well.
It's a great point, almost meeting folks where they are rather than necessarily trying to bridge that gap all at once.
Yeah, and the whole idea, of course, is to free up time and capacity so that those interactions, the more personal interactions, can go on. Now, of course, we have to make sure that we provide the time to do that, and don't lose sight of the efficiency that gains us overall.
I had another question, if I could alternate with you, Mimi. Tracking the Q&A, there's still time, precious little time, but still time for the audience to post a question. So again, as I said at the beginning, I mean, it's so encouraging and positive, this vision. So maybe my last question is on the depressing topic of security. And now, it's not just cybersecurity in the traditional sense of software, but all these devices and cyber physical systems. The sad state of, unfortunately, human beings and humanity is there's an increased attack surface, as they call it, in the vision you painted. Do you feel enough attention is being paid to that, both at the individual components as well as the interfaces you mentioned earlier? And who needs to help solve this problem, in your opinion?
So I think this problem gets more and more complicated the higher in the stack you go, is the way I would think about this. What I see in the individual devices, with lessons learned from, say, 10 years ago about protection from, cyber hacks, right? And so many, I'll speak for ourselves, that our acquisition systems themselves are highly hardened, if you will, to resist that, and to the degree that sometimes gets in the way of sharing information, right? And so that's a careful trade-off there. But the opening of ports and closing them very strategically is really what makes a difference in how data is shared from those devices into that wider system. Now, once you get into the higher level IT systems within a hospital facility, the challenge goes, I'm sure, geometrically upward. And, I don't really have a whole lot of knowledge to offer there in terms of how that might be accomplished. I do know at the device level that you can never do too much, and you never know what threats are out there, but the best thing to be done is to harden those devices so that any interactions are exceptionally well understood and to some degree limited.
Great perspective. Thank you on that. And I'm glad there is that significant progress, at least in one part of the stack. So that's great.
Yeah, and there might be in the others. I'm personally not as involved with that, and I'm sure many people on this call or in SERC as well, probably could bring new information to the healthcare community on this, because we do see ransomware attacks in hospitals. We see them everywhere, of course, but obviously it's especially difficult when those occur in a healthcare facility.
Yeah, I think from what I know of the field, in almost any application, the lower on the stack, the more progress we've made. But so I think the common challenges are being pursued. So you're right. We need to give you a guided tour through the SERC, some of the things that have been done. I think we're out of time. Is that right, Mimi? But if I can offer, again, thank you to David. Wonderful talk, wonderful session. Reminder to our audience that the slides and David's bio are on the SERC Talks website. So thank you, David. And Mimi, would you like to offer our reminders of upcoming events?
Yes, I appreciate the lead-in for that. Yep, our next series is on test and evaluations with Dr. Laura Freeman, another of our SERC Research Council members, moderating that series. And while we have a couple of speakers lined up, some of those dates are tentative to obviously fit everyone's schedule, but tentatively slated for August 4th, October 6th, December 1st. And in the middle of those last two talks, we'll be holding our SERC annual event. So we hope that folks can join us for any and all of those sessions and continue the conversation. Dan, to your point, I am looking at the names of attendees and folks who have registered for today's talk that can definitely offer their insights in this arena. So I'm sure this conversation will continue, and looking forward to it. But thank you again, David, so much for your presentation.
Thank you for the opportunity. Excellent.